I'll just kind of start from the very beginning and run through the modes, and then I will end on ASV, and at that point I will spend some more time on it, and if everybody hasn't gotten glossed over at that point, then we can definitely spend as much time as you want on it. You also have these guides that will help you walk through it, and then you have some flip cards as well that you should have gotten that will explain it. There is more depth about the technology behind ASV as well, but so when you turn the ventilator on, you have one universal button here, on, off, and I'm just going to turn it off really quickly and turn it back on. There we go. Just so that you can see that it defaults to ASV mode, and it's also going to default to an oxygen of 50%, so I'm just going to turn all of that off so that we don't get alarms and everything. You do have the batteries. Are you guys all familiar with the batteries that are here? And you have two what they call hot swappable batteries. And the first one, you just lift the lever and you pop this guy out. And I say err on the side of caution. These are about 5 hours each. So I'd say give yourself four. You have about 10 hours of battery life with these guys if you're unplugged. But just keeping it plugged in will keep the batteries charged at all times. And that just is a magnet and it pops up. So when you turn the ventilator on, you're going to default to this screen, and you're going to notice that you have adult pediatric and then last patient. Adult pediatric, this ventilator can ventilate down to 3 kilograms or 20 cc's. It actually has the option to be neonatal, and it can ventilate down to 200 grams if you ever needed that. You could just program the software in. But you can populate these adult 1, 2, and 3 with pre-programmable shortcut modes. So we could put, what modes do you think you guys use the most here?
SIMD.
SIMD, so volume control SIMD?
Well, yeah, for adults.
So we could put volume control SIMD, we could do pressure control SIMD, we could do CPAP, BiPAP, whatever you wanted to see. You could make these shortcut keys so that you push these and they're already populated for you, so you just start ventilating, okay? The other thing about Hamilton ventilators is that they are based on dialing in a patient's height so that it can calculate ventilating them at an ideal body weight. So it automatically does that calculation for you. And so the other thing that I want you guys to think about is if we do make these shortcut keys, what mils per kilo do you want to see your patients ventilated at consistently? Because we can customize that as well so that that's always there.
Or 6 to 8.
6 to 8. It's defaulted to 8 mils per kilo right now. So if you want it at 6, we can do that. Or if you want me to leave it at 8, we can do that. 7, whatever you guys want to see. So
I guess we go at 8 for now.
okay. How are you guys on the pre-operation? I don't want to spend. I can go over the pre-op check if you want again after.
I think you can skip that for now.
So once you set up your patient, your modes are here. So it's really dial in your gender, patient's height. Or if you don't know the patient's height at that moment, then you can look at them and you go, you should be 70 kilograms. And you can go this way and say you should be about 70 kilograms. And you can go from a backwards approach from it, okay? And then modes are at the top. I'm just going to go through the modes really quickly. The first row of modes, these are volume control modes. These are volume targeted modes. So this is not a true volume control ventilator, it's a volume targeting ventilator. So because it's flow driven, is the reason that it can run without oxygen, compressed gas. It can't actually give you a set volume all the time, but it can target a volume. And it targets a volume by limiting pressure. So this is really, if you're familiar with pressure regulated volume control or volume guarantee, that's really what these modes are. So SCMV, synchronized continuous mandatory ventilation, that's VC plus or volume control plus, or pressure regulated volume control. Okay, so if you ever use these two modes, SCMV plus is assist control volume control, SIMV is the synchronized version of that, you're going to notice that if you dial in your patient's targeted volume, that it's not going to immediately get up to that volume. It's going to take steps to get up to that volume, and it's a safety feature that's built into the ventilator. It doesn't necessarily just, boom, go up to whatever pressure is required to put that volume into the patient's lungs. So the other thing that you're going to notice here is that there is every ventilator has a flow sensor. This flow sensor just happens to be outside of the ventilator instead of at the ventilator or inside of the ventilator. And so what it's doing from breath to breath is it's measuring inspiratory and expiratory flow rates, inspiratory, expiratory volumes, inspiratory, expiratory pressures. And from that information, it's calculating airway resistance and static compliance from breath to breath. And so that's how it knows how to step up the pressure to get the volume in, is based on how constricted are the airways, and how stiff or how not stiff, open are the alveoli, okay, based on the patient's pathophysiology, okay? So that's why if you go into one of these modes, you're going to confirm. You're going to set a volume, and this just defaulted to 8 cc's or 8 mils per kilogram, but I can manipulate that if I want my lung likes 400. Okay, change my rate. Okay, I'm going to turn that off. Okay, and then once I confirm I'm ready to ventilate, I can also go in and I can it automatically sets my alarms, but they're pretty tight. It's 10%, 10 to 15% above and below. So they're very tight, but you can go ahead and start ventilating the patient on this and then come back and change those when you have time, okay? So we're gonna start ventilating. And once you start ventilating, everything changes. You get your control settings over here on your right, your graphics in the middle, and then your monitoring parameters, which are customizable, by the way, on the left side. So we can change those so that you can see what you want to see here. Right now it's peak pressure, minute ventilation, exhale tidal volume, and total rate. Under the monitoring tab, that's where more information is. You have your peak pressures, your mean airway pressures, your PEEP, your analyzed oxygen versus your set oxygen, your exhale tidal volume, your total rate, your minute ventilation, and your I to E ratio. On the second page, you have your I and your E times specifically. If this patient were breathing spontaneously, you get that information populated there. You get your inspiratory and your expiratory flow rates, and the difference between those two is what creates your leak or what calculates your leak. So that information is there. And then on the third page, you get more pulmonary specific information, your airway resistance, your static compliance. If this patient were weaning and you wanted to see some different parameters like P100s or transpulmonary pressures, those would automatically populate there. Static compliance, exhaled time constant, how long is it taking for the air to get out of the lung, and plateau pressures are all, okay? And that's automatically populating, so you don't have to do maneuvers on this ventilator, if you're familiar with that. Yep, it's going to be on the third page. Right here. So there's no pause for auto peak or for plateau pressure. Okay? They're automatic. So you get auto peak here, and this, I just have this on a setting that I have no air trapping. So it's here, and then plateau's here. And if the patient, this is the one thing that drives me nuts. I just wish that this was on the second page with that. In case you're wondering. Okay. So that's volume control, assist control. And so from what you were saying, a lot of the patients when they come in, you guys do a lot of you sedate and paralyze them. This would probably be a fully appropriate mode for you guys to put them on, just because they're not going to be spontaneously breathing. So you may not need an SIMV mode at all as part of your shortcut key, but that's just food for thought, okay? The second row down, these are all your pressure controlling or pressure control modes. So you have PCV plus is assist control pressure control. So if you have a patient and you're really concerned about them decompensating or desaturating when you put them from bagging onto the ventilator, you would probably want to go directly into a pressure control mode, because you're not going to have to worry about the ramping up of pressure to get to the pressure and the volume that maybe you were bagging at, right? Does that make sense? So, so that is pressure control mode. So if you say I'm going to put them on 20 cc's of 20 centimeters of water pressure, then they're going to, second breath, they're going to be at 20 centimeters of water pressure, and they're going to get the volumes that parallel that, okay? PCV SIMV is your SIMV version of pressure control. SPONT is pressure control CPAP weaning mode, which I don't know if you guys really use. If you have that patient who's you just can't keep up with their respiratory rate and their drive to breathe is really, really strong, Sometimes you can put them in this mode just to allow them to breathe on their own. I don't know if that's ever applicable to you guys, but that's what spontaneous mode is. DuoCap and APRV, they are like BiPAP for an intubated patient. So you set a high pressure and you set a low pressure, and then you set a time, how long do you want them to breathe at this high pressure, and how long do you want them to breathe at this low pressure. And the reason for these modes are a lot of places want to inverse ratio the way that the patient breathes, so they want them to breathe 7 times longer in than they want out. And the reason that they do that is to try and fix patients that are having a really terrible oxidation problem, where they're trying to maybe, they need to be intubated, but they're also trying to maybe push fluids back down into the lymphatic system, that sort of thing, okay? And then ASV is the adaptive support ventilation mode. That's the full closed loop mode. And so ASV, if you think about ASV, what it's going to do is it's going to start the patient in VC+, SCMV+. And then as the patient starts to take over their own breathing, or they start to use their diaphragm and trigger their own breaths, then it will switch them into VC plus SIMV, so that they can have some controlled breaths, some spontaneous breaths. And then once the patient starts to take up over 50% of their own breathing, then it'll flip them into full spontaneous mode. So they're triggering their own breaths and they're flow cycling all of their own breaths instead of the machine time cycling it or pressure cycling it. Okay, if that makes sense at all. So the difference here is that if you have a patient who starts to wake up and they start breathing on their own, it mimics natural breathing physiology. It allows them to start negative pressure breathing instead of positive pressure breathing when they want to versus when we want them to, if that makes sense at all. Okay?
That's an ASV.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay.
And so it's full closed loop. So let's say you have a patient, they're completely sedated, completely paralyzed. You put them on ASV, it's going to put them completely in SCMV, or volume targeted pressure limited breathing. And it's going to completely give them all the pressure support that they need to meet their minute ventilation demands, that you have set their minute ventilation demands. And then if, for whatever reason, you decide to wean off of their sedation or wean their paralytic off, and they start to trigger their own breaths, then they'll go into SI, volume control SIMV. So some will be controlled, some will be spontaneous, and the best way for me to do is just show you, and we'll get there. And then if they completely start to wake up and you're weaning them, which I know you guys don't really do, then they would start to flow cycle and breathe completely on their own. And then if they went back under sedation, for whatever reason they didn't clear the sedation appropriately, then it would kick back into SCMV+. So it can sense that. Okay? And then your last row here are your non-invasive modes. NIV is BiPAP without a backup time or a backup rate. So you set pressure support as your IPAP or your inspiratory pressure, and then PEEP CPAP, that's your expiratory pressure. So a high pressure and a low pressure that they're breathing at. You can also turn pressure support off, and you could have this run as a CPAP machine. Okay? The only thing here is that you don't, unless you set an apnea timer for a backup, you don't have a backup rate kicking in to say, hey, breathe, okay? No, nothing that's, tapping on their shoulder. Okay? NIV-ST is non-invasive, spontaneous, or synchronized timed BiPAP. And so the difference here is you add that rate and the I time with that rate. So if they stop breathing for whatever reason, if your rate was set at 12 every 5 seconds, it's going to give them a burst of high pressure at whatever you set your I time for, to get them to trigger that inspiratory pressure so they start breathing again. So this is just setting up, this is not giving them a rate, it's a backup rate in case they stop breathing. Okay?
And that breath will be given at the pressure support. Pressure.
And I don't know if you guys ever do this, but I would encourage you to, I don't know if you have bacterial filters, just to put a filter on and try and see what it feels like to breathe in these different modes, or put the mask on and, see if, what it feels like. I don't know if you guys have been doing that, but
yeah,
I just put your mask on your face, FYI. So that's the modes in general. I've gone over the monitoring utilities. If you're just wondering what these tabs are, utility is, if you were in standby, you could put this in a low pressure oxygen mode, and you could run this on an oxygen concentrator if you wanted to. for patients who needed home ventilator. Configuration is how we can customize this information that you see, and then data transfer is just transferring each ventilator like a jump drive. Events, these are all of your alarms and all of your control setting changes that you've had on this patient. It stores 1,000 of those. And system, this is how many hours you've been operating the ventilator, how much battery life you have, and then if this is ever informative to some people, what your oxygen consumption is, your VO2. And tests and calibrations, that's just a backdoor entry into your pre-op check sensors. This is how I would turn that oxygen cell off so it doesn't alarm on us. And then settings, you can control how bright you want the screen. You guys don't have to do this, but daylight savings and how loud. That's to wake some of you guys up in the back, okay? Or how not loud you want the alarm, and we can default that to what you want to hear. So that's in general everything that you're going to see here on the screen. This is also your start standby screen. So if I push this, it's a two-step process to activate standby. This dims the screen. This locks the screen so that you can't inadvertently make changes. This lung button gives you manual breaths. This is one way that if you were using SCMD Plus and you wanted them to get up to their volume faster, you could hit this repeatedly, and by doing this, really what you're doing is increasing their minute ventilation, so you could get them to ramp up to the volume that you're targeting quicker. Cancel that. Increase oxygen, that's just going to take you to 100% oxygen for 2 minutes, and it tells you that. Turn it off, and it takes me back down because we don't want it to alarm. This print screen, it looks like a printer. If you put a thumb drive in here, you could do screenshots and send them to us if you ever have anything that you're trying to troubleshoot. And it looks like a spray paint can here. This is how you turn on the flow meter that drives the nebulizer. I don't know if you guys have used that function at all, but I'll turn it off so it didn't holler at us. So the only thing that I haven't really shown you is that there are, when you are ventilating, you have a screen within a screen. So if I touch my graphics, I open up the screen within a screen, and I can open up more graphics. And this is where playing around with the ventilator really comes in, because you won't know much about this unless you get in there and work with it. You can default look at pressure and flow waveforms or scalars, time scalars. If I touch this and I want to see a volume scalar, I tap this guy, and now I have a pressure and a volume waveform. You can't change the pressure, it's always going to be there. You can't turn that off. You can turn off the bottom one so that you just see a pressure waveform if you want. Tap the screen. I can also go into graphics, and a lot of people like to see the dynamic lung, because the dynamic lung, if you put this directly on a patient and you don't know very much history about the patient, you can use the flow sensor to get pulmonary mechanic information from them. So in this case, I have a nice healthy lung, nice peak bronchioles. I have a display of what their airway resistance is, 8 in this case, and what their static compliance is, 63. So everything's normal. But if I were to increase airway resistance, or if I had a patient who came in and they were bronchospasming, or they had a lot of edematous airway, then I may not get an audible low tidal volume alarm, but what I would get after 8 to 10 breaths, that the airways are going to change colors. So they'll be red instead of pink. And then you see that this airway resistance number is starting to increase, and so now they're starting to change colors. And also you see that the lungs are not nice and open, they're starting to box, and so it's showing that they're stiff because of the obstruction here. So I don't know if you guys ever used the lung or not. No? Have you seen it? Yeah? Okay. So that's what it looks like if you have someone who has high airway resistance. So a lot of pressure to get air from point A to point B. And then if you have a stiff lung, like this uni lung here, you'll see that your airways are also very boxy, and your static compliance is going to go go down, sorry. Okay? And even though I don't have airway resistance in the bronchioles, I have maybe inflammation in the lower airways somewhere, okay? And so you can use this function just to kind of give you some background information on your patient if you don't know history, okay? And that's just from the graphic image. And the reason that we started using this image is that for a lot of people, they understand what they see, and sometimes they don't understand the values associated with airway resistance or static compliance. It's hard to remember all those numbers and values, it ranges.
We have a patient that comes in here that just has one lung.
Mhm.
What would it show?
It would be boxy like this.
But it would show both.
Yeah, it'll show both lungs, yeah.
No, he just has, no, he's like, doesn't have
Mhm.
one whole side.
So, yeah, so for patients
just
that have a
wondering what
lobectomy or have a pneumonectomy, it will still show both lungs, but it will be, their compliance will be diminished. So it'll be boxy like this instead of nice and open. But like I said, it takes 8 breaths because it trends instead of these transient things happening. It's trending this information so that it takes a minute for you to actually see the change. The other thing is that so now that's nice and normal, but your patient that comes in that has is down on,
Pneumonectomy?
would have boxed out lungs because their compliance is going to be lower, I would assume. So if I touch the screen again, I don't think that you guys would probably really need to use the vent status screen. You may, but this is more of a weaning information screen. So it's going to tell you, when you have met oxygenation weaning requirements, ventilation weaning requirements, those sorts of things. If I tap the screen again, I can look at loops. And so if you ever want to get any information about pressure volume information, you can look at a pressure volume loop or a pressure flow loop, and those are available as well. It also tells you their airway resistance, their static compliance, and their exhale time constant on this as well. Tap it again and you can trend. So if there was a patient and you were wanting to see maybe, you were wanting to trend their static compliance and their airway resistance maybe. It's always trending all of this information. It's just a matter if you want to access this graphic and look at it. So if I pull this waveform down and I scroll through, all of this data is being trended at all times. And it can trend it for as long as the patient's been on the ventilator, so it can trend up to 72 hours. So if you've had a patient that they've been on the ventilator for 12 hours and you're wanting to see, maybe you're concerned that they are going into ARDS or something like that, then you can look at static compliance over 12 hours, confirm it, and you're going to get a trending bar. It doesn't really mean anything unless you push this button here, and now as I scroll through, it's telling me at every minute within those 12 hours what that static compliance was from minute to minute. So you could get a scatter plot, or you could get a nice consistent trending depending on what was going on with the patient. Since this is trying to trend over 12 hours, it's probably not very, let's go 1 hour. There's a 1 hour trend, so you can see a little bit more trending data. So that's also available. But I just wanted to let you guys know that that's what is the screen within the screen if you're ever looking at that, okay? So if I wanted to go back to my waveforms, help me out here, what would I do?
X out.
I'm going to go to waveforms right here, and I'm going to I have pressure always by default, right? Right, okay. So I'm going to go to volume because I maybe want to see a pressure and a volume waveform, all right? Or what if I wanted to see a pressure and a flow waveform instead? What do? They're going to be
Go
quick.
back.
Tap the screen, change it to flow, right? Okay. So that's the modes in general. What kind of questions do you have about this before I move on to ASV?
We did find out when playing with it, we put the SVN up,
Uh-huh.
and it wasn't working until we put the test slug on,
Uh-huh.
and then it was just nebulizing in spurts.